December 2nd, 1942, 14 kilometers east of Tebourba, Tunisia, 10:20 hours in the morning. A column from Panzergrenadier Regiment 104 had just crushed an American roadblock along the dusty road between Tebourba and Matur. The fight had lasted less than 20 minutes. A few burning trucks, scattered bodies, and the faint smell of cordite were all that remained. The German soldiers, veterans of the desert campaign, moved among the wreckage with the weary precision of men for whom destruction had become routine. Then Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Bremer noticed something strange lying in a shallow ditch beside the road. A long steel tube, scorched at one end, wires coiled crudely along its side. It looked like debris, perhaps a part of a vehicle exhaust or a damaged radio antenna. Yet it had been carefully painted in olive drab, and near the charred grip, faint white letters were still visible beneath the soot. Bremer squatted, brushed away the dust, and frowned. It was absurdly light, barely 3 kilograms, and shockingly primitive. No optics, no moving parts, no cooling jacket, just a simple pipe with a wire trigger and a battery box taped to one side. "Amerikanischer Dreck," muttered one of the grenadiers. "American trash." They laughed. But their laughter faded when they saw what lay 50 meters down the track, a Panzer Three, still smoking. The tank had been hit squarely in the front during the skirmish an hour earlier. Its turret sat locked halfway left, the hatch gaping open. Smoke rose from the engine compartment, mingling with the acrid stench of burned rubber and fuel. The driver and gunner lay half out of the hatch, their uniforms scorched, their faces blackened beyond recognition. Bremer climbed onto the glacis plate and froze. Where the armor had once been 5 centimeters thick, there was now a hole the size of a man's fist. It was not an impact mark like those left by solid shot. The edges were melted, jagged, and bubbled, as if the steel had been eaten away by fire. It looked impossible. A shell from an anti-tank gun left a dent, a fracture, a tear. This was something different, as though the metal had been liquefied. He ran his gloved hand along the rim of the hole. The steel was still warm. At 10:23, Lieutenant Dieter Kranz arrived, a thin man with desert dust crusted into the seams of his uniform. Bremer pointed silently at the hole, then at the steel tube lying nearby. Kranz bent down, lifted the strange weapon, and studied it. "Too light for a cannon," he said. "Too crude for a mine." "It burned through 5 centimeters of armor," Bremer replied. Kranz said nothing. He looked again at the Panzer Three, then at the launcher. The same thought formed in both their minds. If a foot soldier could carry something like this, and if it could do that, then everything the Wehrmacht believed about tank warfare was in danger. At 10:41, a staff car from battalion headquarters arrived, its fenders splattered with mud. Out stepped Hauptmann Ernst Krüger, the adjutant. He was furious about the delay in the advance, until he saw the dead tank. Then his anger vanished. "What did this?" he demanded. Bremer pointed wordlessly to the tube. Krüger stared, then barked a laugh. "You're joking. That? It's a piece of plumbing." But no one laughed with him. Kranz held the launcher out. "It's real, Herr Hauptmann, and it did this." Krüger hesitated. The weapon was warm to the touch, faintly greasy, the paint blistered from heat. He turned it over, reading the markings. The English words, rocket launcher and ordnance department, stood out clearly. He called for the unit photographer. "Take everything," he ordered. "Close-ups of the armor, the hole, the weapon." Then he turned to Bremer. "Wrap it in a ground sheet. It goes straight to Tunis." By noon, the captured weapon was on its way to headquarters, wrapped in canvas like some alien artifact. For 3 years, German doctrine had been founded on one idea. Tanks decided battles. Armor led, infantry followed. From the plains of Poland to the fields of France and the steppes of Russia, speed and steel had crushed slower armies. The tank was the instrument of decision, the spear point of the Reich. Now, in a few seconds of smoke and fire, that principle had been challenged. The report that evening, written by the division's technical officer, was brief but astonishing. Enemy employs portable rocket weapon, estimated caliber 60 mm, electrically ignited, effect of hollow charge comparable to 75 mm anti-tank shell, range under 100 meters. One Panzer Three destroyed by single hit. Within 72 hours, the summary reached Berlin. At the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office engineers examined the captured launcher. They measured its length, noted the crude electrical firing circuit, and carefully unscrewed the warhead from a recovered rocket. The warhead was a simple steel cone lined with copper, filled with a shaped explosive charge. When fired, the explosion focused its force into a narrow jet of molten metal that could pierce armor by melting it. German engineers recognized the principle immediately, the Hohlladung, or hollow charge, but they had never imagined it applied in such a light, disposable form. Their report, dated December 5, 1942, read, American Infantry Rocket Launcher, Model M1A1, weight 3.2 kilograms. Simple construction, steel tube with electric trigger, penetration of 5 centimeters, homogeneous armor at 80 meters, extremely effective against medium tanks, manufacture possible without precision tools. Recommendation: immediate development of German equivalent. In plain language, they had discovered the future of infantry warfare. Back in Tunisia, German tank crews began to whisper about a new American secret weapon, a hand rocket, they called it, fired by infantry hiding behind walls or in olive groves. The fear spread quickly. Some crews welded spare track links to their hulls, others piled sandbags across the front plates. It made no difference. The shaped charge cut through everything. One night, Bremer overheard a tank commander muttering, "If every American has one of those pipes, the war is finished." The weapon was given a name that soon echoed across the Afrika Korps, the Bazooka. Weeks later, in Berlin, General Major Becker of the Army Ordnance Office prepared a secret memorandum for the General Staff. He compared the bazooka's cost less than a field radio with that of a Panzer IV, which required months of factory time and thousands of kilograms of steel. He concluded grimly, "If the Americans equip every infantry section with such devices, the tank will no longer hold the battlefield. The concept of armored supremacy will end." His memo circulated quietly among senior officers, but few believed it. The German way of war was built on the tank, fast, decisive, unstoppable. The idea that a single foot soldier could end that dominance seemed absurd, and yet, on that dry Tunisian morning, amid the smell of dust and burned fuel, a single weapon had done exactly that. Years later, in post-war interrogations, Hauptmann Kruger recalled the moment he first held the captured launcher. "It was light, ridiculous. I thought it was a toy, but our tank was dead. I realized then that the Americans had solved the problem we never could. They had made every infantryman a tank killer. The bazooka would soon be copied, refined, and reborn as the German Panzer Schreck and Panzerfaust. But that December day near Tebourba marked the first crack in the myth of German armoured invincibility. As the sun set over the Tunisian hills, Bremer stood beside the burned-out Panzer, watching the heat shimmer rise. From the armour, the desert wind carried the faint hiss of cooling metal. He said nothing, but he knew he had seen something history would remember, the moment when a cheap steel tube changed the balance of war. The weapon from Tunisia lay on a steel table in the Heereswaffenamt laboratory at Kummersdorf. Around it stood 5 men in grey tunics, their breath misting in the cold. Engineers, ordnance officers, and one representative from the Panzertruppen inspection. They had seen captured 34s, British 6-pounders, and Soviet anti-tank rifles, but never anything like this. The object was almost laughable, a thin metal tube barely longer than a man's height, open at both ends, a crude wooden grip wired to a small battery box. No optics, no recoil system, no complex machining. It looked like something built in a workshop, not a factory. And yet, in the field report beside it, one short sentence had left the entire room silent. Single projectile penetrated 5 centimeters armor of Panzer Three front plate. Major Hans Müller, senior engineer for infantry weapons testing, adjusted his spectacles and examined the device. He could not stop shaking his head. "It should not be possible," he said. "Not with this weight, not with that diameter." Another officer, Oberstleutnant Weber from the armoured branch, spoke coldly. And yet it happened. They unscrewed the rocket's nose cone. Inside was a copper-lined cavity, a perfect cone filled with a waxy explosive compound, a shaped charge, familiar in theory, but never applied in such a small weapon. When fired, it focused the explosive energy into a jet of molten metal that burned through armor instead of striking it apart. The Americans had taken a laboratory experiment and given it to every infantryman. Müller weighed the empty warhead in his hand. 3 kilograms, perhaps, he murmured, and it defeats our tanks. The silence in the room grew heavy. For years, German doctrine had placed its faith in the tank. The Panzer was not merely a weapon, it was a philosophy, a manifestation of speed, will, and industrial strength. The infantry existed to protect the tank, not the other way around. Now, this absurd American pipe was threatening to reverse the entire relationship. That evening, the engineers prepared their first live test. In the firing range at Kummersdorf, they mounted a captured French light tank as target. At a distance of 80 meters, the American launcher roared. The rocket hissed across the range, struck the armor, and vanished in a burst of orange light. When the smoke cleared, there was a fist-sized hole through both sides of the hull. No one spoke. Finally, Müller said, "Gentlemen, the Americans have ended armor's monopoly." The report that followed was clinical and devastating. Dated December 28, 1942, it concluded, U.S. rocket launcher M1A1 demonstrates unprecedented efficiency for infantry employment. Penetration approximately 5 centimeters at 80 meters. Device can be produced with minimal precision tools. Electric ignition primitive but reliable. Recommend immediate study for domestic adaptation. It was the most reluctant admiration imaginable, and it spread quickly. Copies reached the Panzer Inspectorate, the Ordnance Office, and eventually the Führerhauptquartier. Hitler himself was briefed in January 1943. According to later testimony, he dismissed it at first as another Italian toy. But after demonstrations in spring, he ordered accelerated work on a German equivalent. That order would produce the Ofenrohr, the stovepipe, soon to be renamed Panzerschreck. In field headquarters across North Africa, however, disbelief still ruled. To many German commanders, the bazooka seemed an isolated curiosity, a rare weapon found by chance. Reports from the front spoke of occasional rocket guns, of small-caliber tubes. Few realized that American factories were already producing them by the tens of thousands. American logistics, invisible and immense, were rewriting the arithmetic of war. The weapon cost less than a pair of boots and could be built without machine tools. A small workshop in Ohio could produce hundreds a day. By early 1943, every U.S. infantry company in North Africa possessed at least 2 of them, often more. The mathematics of mass replaced the prestige of design. In Berlin, Müller recognized that difference and feared it. "We can design one," he told his superiors, "but they can build 1 million." He was right. The Reich could innovate. It could not replicate American abundance. German factories were already strained building tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Aluminum was short, copper scarce, and labor exhausted. The idea of arming every infantryman with a rocket launcher was industrial fantasy. By contrast, in the United States, entire assembly lines were retooled for bazookas within weeks. Children in school scrap drives collected the steel that would become launch tubes. Workers at General Electric wired the simple battery ignitions by hand. The U.S. Army planned to issue 1 launcher per squad, a number so vast it defied German comprehension. The bazooka was not a marvel of craftsmanship, it was a triumph of accessibility. In February 1943, the German General Staff met in a closed session to discuss the weapon's implications. The minutes, later recovered by Allied intelligence, recorded one line that captured the mood. If the Americans continue to arm the infantryman with such devices, armored warfare as we have conceived it will be impossible. It was an extraordinary admission, the first crack in the intellectual armor of blitzkrieg. From that moment, the German army's technologists became obsessed. Orders flowed to the chemical laboratories at Doberitz and the design bureau at Rheinmetall-Borsig. Develop a domestic version with greater range and power. Within months, prototypes appeared heavier, longer, fitted with blast shields to protect the firer from the rocket's backblast. They would call it Raketenpanzerbüchse, rocket anti-tank rifle. Soldiers, inevitably, called it what it resembled, Panzerschreck, the tank's terror. Yet even as engineers raced to imitate it, many officers refused to accept the lesson behind it. The Americans had not merely invented a new weapon, they had redefined who could use it. The bazooka was democracy in steel, a tool for the ordinary soldier that made him equal to the tank ace. It required neither factories nor elite training, only courage and a steady hand. That concept that power could be distributed, not concentrated, was something the authoritarian mind could never quite understand. And so, through the winter of 1942 into 1943, while snow covered the ruins of Stalingrad and Allied ships gathered off North Africa, the German war machine confronted an idea more dangerous than any single weapon, that the Americans had solved infantry warfare not by sophistication, but by simplicity. The Panzer still ruled the battlefield for now, but in every smoking crater where armor melted like wax, a new reality was being written, one that no German engineer could erase. The Desert War was ending, though few on either side yet admitted it. The German Afrika Korps was trapped between the British Eighth Army pressing from the east and the American II Corps driving from the west. What remained of Panzer Army Afrika was starving, exhausted, and bleeding fuel faster than it could be delivered. Yet even in its final weeks, North Africa would offer one last lesson, one the Germans would carry with them for the rest of the war. On the morning of April 8th, a reconnaissance element of the 10th Panzer Division advanced toward El Guettar, expecting only light resistance. Instead, they found the slopes ahead bristling with American infantrymen of the 1st Infantry Division, veterans now, hardened by months of mistakes and lessons. Among their equipment were long green tubes, the latest issue from stateside factories, the improved M1A1 rocket launcher. They called it the Bazooka. At 0900 hours, the Germans attacked. 4 Panzer Three led, supported by 2 Panzer IVs and a handful of half-tracks. The desert floor shook as they advanced. To their crews, it was a familiar sight, the slow, deliberate crawl of armor across open terrain, guns scanning for targets, machine guns ready to cut down any infantry in the way. But this time, the infantry did not run. They waited. Sergeant Robert Nash of Company G remembered later, "We had been told what to do. Let them come. Let them get close." He knelt behind a sand berm, the bazooka balanced on his shoulder. The rocket was awkward, heavy, and unreliable. It had a habit of misfiring if the battery was weak, but it gave a man power he had never known before. When the lead panzer came within 70 yards, Nash fired. The rocket streaked out with a loud hiss, a trail of white smoke curling across the sand. It struck just below the turret ring. A bright orange flash burst from the impact point, followed by black smoke. The tank lurched, then stopped dead, flames licking from its engine vents. The other panzers swung their turrets toward the source of the shot, but the Americans were already shifting positions. Within seconds, 2 more rockets streaked out, slamming into the side armor of another tank. Its hatch blew open. A figure climbed halfway out, then fell back inside. The attack dissolved. By 0915, 3 tanks were burning. The remaining 2 withdrew under smoke cover. It was the first time German tank crews had encountered the bazooka in massed numbers. They were stunned. Reports from survivors reached regimental command by afternoon. Enemy infantry employ. Rocket weapons in large quantity. Hits at close range catastrophic. Recommend greater spacing and immediate suppression of infantry. The psychological effect was worse than the material one. For the first time, tank crews felt hunted not by other tanks or artillery, but by foot soldiers. The open desert, once their domain, was suddenly filled with invisible threats. When word of the incident reached Berlin weeks later, the tone of official correspondence changed. What had been treated as a technical curiosity became a matter of urgency. A conference at the Ordnance Office on May 12, 1943, produced a directive labelled Sofortentwicklung, immediate development. The weapon to be produced would fire a larger rocket, 8.5 centimeters in diameter, capable of defeating any Allied tank then in service. Engineers at the Hugo Schneider AG works in Leipzig began work within days. They combined the principle of the bazooka with German craftsmanship, a longer tube, sturdier grips, and a detachable blast shield to protect the firer from the backblast. The project name was Raketenpanzerbüchse 54. It would become infamous as the Panzerschreck. Yet even as design began, officers at the front were drawing darker conclusions. General Bayerlein, then serving under Rommel, later recalled, "When we saw the bazooka used in Tunisia, we understood that armor had lost its invulnerability. It was not the weapon itself that frightened us, it was what it represented. The Americans had given initiative to the infantryman. Every man could now destroy a tank. That was revolutionary." He was right. The bazooka had democratized destruction. In the last days before surrender, when German units collapsed around Cape Bon, more than 50 captured bazookas were collected by Allied ordnance teams. Some had been taken by the Germans themselves for study. Others lay beside their former owners, half buried in sand. The Americans had treated them as tools. The Germans treated them as revelations. By mid-May, German engineers had already reverse-engineered the weapon completely. Blueprints of the Panzerschreck were drawn by June, test models fired by July. By autumn, the first units were shipping to the Eastern Front. The speed of replication was extraordinary, but imitation was not understanding. For while Germany built a larger, more powerful version, it never grasped the philosophy behind it. The bazooka was not just an anti-tank device, it was a shift in doctrine. It allowed dispersed infantry to resist mechanized assault, to ambush armor without artillery support, to operate independently. It was war made flexible. German commanders, however, continued to see it as an auxiliary tool, useful, yes, but subordinate to the tank and gun. The bazooka's true significance, its democratization of power, was lost in translation. After the war, in 1946, captured German officers were questioned about their first encounters with the bazooka. 1. Oberst Franz Becker summed up the experience in a few bitter words. It was a peasant's weapon, crude, cheap, ugly. But it killed kings. He meant the panzer crews, the knights of Germany's mechanized age undone by a farmer's son with a steel tube on his shoulder. In Tunisia, that truth had been revealed in the simplest terms. As the Afrika Korps burned beneath the desert sun, a handful of American infantrymen with a new kind of weapon had rewritten the future of war. And somewhere among the smoking wrecks near El Guetar, a German officer stared at the melted front plate of a Panzer IV and whispered what many others were beginning to realize. The age of armor is ending. The wind carried the sound of distant artillery from the testing grounds at Ares, where German engineers were conducting final trials of their new creation, the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54. The men who watched that morning could not help but feel a strange mixture of pride and unease. Pride because they had built something formidable, unease because they knew where the idea had come from. The first Panzerschreck launcher stood propped on its bipod, its dark tube longer and thicker than the American original. A wooden shoulder rest had been added, and a sheet metal blast shield welded near the rear to protect the firer from the fierce backblast. The projectile, an 8.5 centimeter rocket with a shaped charge warhead, looked almost identical to the American bazooka round, except larger and more carefully machined. At 0900 hours, the demonstration began. A captured Soviet 34 tank, long since immobilized, waited as target at a distance of 70 meters. The firer, wearing a blackened face cloth and heavy gloves, knelt in the mud. The officer in charge raised his hand. Fewer! The rocket leapt from the tube with a thunderous roar, trailing a column of white smoke. A heartbeat later, it struck the 34 just above the track guards. The explosion punched a glowing hole clean through the armor, spraying molten metal across the field. When the smoke cleared, a silent awe settled over the observers. The ordnance officer turned to his commander and said quietly, "Now the infantry can kill anything." Within weeks, the weapon was ordered into mass production. Factories in Leipzig, Magdeburg, and Berlin began retooling to assemble thousands of launchers and rockets. The name Panzerschreck, Tank Terror, was officially approved by the Propaganda Ministry in August 1943. Soldiers preferred a simpler nickname, Ofenrohr, the stovepipe. By autumn, the first units reached the Eastern Front. The baptism of fire came near Vitebsk, where retreating infantry of Army Group Center used them to ambush Soviet armor during the chaotic battles of that winter. Reports were ecstatic. A single team had destroyed 3 tanks in 5 minutes. At last, the infantry could hold the line without waiting for anti-tank guns or Luftwaffe support. But there was irony beneath the triumph. The German version was powerful, too powerful. The enormous backblast gave away the shooter's position. The weapon was heavy and difficult to carry, and most importantly, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to supply enough of them. For every Panzerschreck built, the Americans shipped 100 bazookas. In Washington, meanwhile, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was already improving the design. The M9 model entered production in late 1943, collapsible, lighter, with better ignition and sights. The Americans understood what the Germans did not, that a weapon's worth lay not only in its performance, but in its producibility. By 1944, U.S. factories were turning out 15,000 launchers per month. German plants, under bombing and shortages, struggled to make a few thousand. The result was mathematical inevitability. Where the Germans sought perfection, the Americans sought abundance. In the field, however, ideology gave way to necessity. German soldiers loved the Panzerschreck. In Italy, in Normandy, in the ruins of Stalingrad, infantrymen used it with deadly skill. It could destroy any Allied tank, Shermans, Churchills, Cromwells, with a single shot. Its enormous rocket left a streak of white smoke like a signal to the heavens, but its effect was biblical. A veteran of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, later wrote, "We feared no tank after we had the Panzerschreck, but we feared its smoke. Fire once, and every gun within a kilometer turned toward you." The weapon's success on the battlefield could not hide a deeper truth. The balance of power had already shifted. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority, artillery, and logistics rendered German tactical innovations meaningless. No weapon, no matter how lethal, could compensate for the loss of oil, steel, and men. Still, the Panzerschreck earned its place in legend. At Normandy, single teams destroyed entire Allied columns. In the Ardennes, they stalked Shermans through snow and fog, leaving burning wrecks along forest roads. The weapon gave courage to soldiers who otherwise faced hopeless odds. It restored, if only briefly, the illusion of parity. Yet the irony was cruel. The Panzerschreck was the child of desperation born from an American idea, refined by German engineering, and doomed by German industry's collapse. Back in East Prussia, the original engineers followed its progress with mixed feelings. Hans Müller, the same man who had first studied the captured bazooka at Kummersdorf, wrote in his private notes in November 1944, "We copied their idea, but not their philosophy. The Americans created a soldier's weapon. We created a weapon for heroes, and we have run out of heroes." By then, Germany's cities burned nightly under Allied bombing. Trains carried refugees instead of ammunition. Even the Panzerschreck required materials that no longer existed: copper for the shaped charge liners, magnesium for the rockets, steel for the tubes. Production faltered. Frontline soldiers improvised, cutting launchers from drain pipes, wiring triggers with telephone batteries. The once proud industrial empire of the Reich had been reduced to workshop tinkering a mirror image of the crude bazooka they had once mocked. In early 1945, American soldiers advancing through the Rhineland found Panzerschrecks in every village. Some lay abandoned, others were still warm beside the bodies of their users. The irony was complete. The weapon that had begun as a crude American tube and evolved into a German masterpiece now littered the ground of a dying Reich. After the war, Allied intelligence compared the two weapons. The technical report from the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground concluded, the German Panzerschreck demonstrates improved destructive power, but inferior tactical utility. The American bazooka remains the superior design in terms of mobility, mass production, and battlefield adaptability. In simple terms, America had built a weapon for a citizen army. Germany had built one for a dying elite. In the ruins of Berlin, spring of 1945, a captured Panzerschreck lay among the rubble of the Reich Chancellery. A war correspondent photographed it beside a burned-out Panzer IV, the beginning and end of Germany's armoured dream captured in one frame. The caption beneath the photograph, printed later in a British newspaper, read simply, "They laughed at the pipe. Then they built it themselves." It was the perfect epitaph for the bazooka and its legacy, a reminder that the future of warfare had shifted forever, not through complexity, but through simplicity. The age of the tank was not over, but it would never again be uncontested. From the dunes of Tunisia to the snows of the Ardennes, the echo of that discovery remained the hiss of a rocket, the flash of shaped fire, and the quiet realization that the power to destroy armor no longer belonged to the few, but to the many. August 1945. The guns were silent. The cities lay in ruins, their streets filled with the echo of boots that no longer marched. Across two oceans, armies began the work of understanding what had happened and how the world's greatest armored forces had been humbled, not by bigger guns or heavier tanks, but by a weapon that could fit in a single soldier's hands. In the captured German archives at Oberammergau, American analysts uncovered reports detailing the development of the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust. Among the documents were copies of the original Tunisian field notes from 1942, the discovery of the first bazooka, its crude sketches and the words "highly effective against armor." The irony was profound. 3 years of devastation had followed from that simple observation. At the same time, on the other side of the world, U.S. Marines landing on Okinawa and Luzon were rediscovering the same truth their comrades had learned in North Africa. Against Japanese bunkers and pillboxes, the bazooka had become indispensable. It was no longer just a tank killer, it was a fortress breaker, a door opener, a weapon that had made engineering charges nearly obsolete. By the end of the Pacific Campaign, every Marine platoon carried multiple launchers. In after-action reports, officers described them with reverence, usually reserved for artillery. No other weapon delivered equivalent firepower at such close range. The infantryman, how long the least glamorous of soldiers, had become the decisive figure in modern war. After the war, as the USO. Army compiled its Strategic Bombing Survey and Combat Lessons series. One conclusion repeated again and again: firepower must belong to the lowest level. The bazooka had proven that the modern battlefield was no longer the realm of specialists. It was a place where every soldier must be capable of independent destruction. At the Pentagon, planners spoke of a democratization of lethality. The phrase came from a quiet analyst named Colonel Harold Potter, who wrote in his 1946 memorandum, "The bazooka represents the death of centralized firepower. In future wars, the decisive act will not come from the artillery battery or the armored regiment, but from the individual soldier who can carry decisive power on his shoulder." The weapon's spirit, simple, cheap, devastating, would become the blueprint for an entire family of successors. The German-inspired Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust evolved into the Soviet RPG. The American bazooka would give birth to the M20 Super Bazooka, and later to the M72 LAW and AT4. Each was a child of the same revelation that a man with a tube could bring down a tank. But for the men who had first faced the bazooka, The memory was not academic, it was visceral. Oberleutnant Franz Kessler, who had commanded a Panzer IV company at El Ghoutar, was captured in Tunisia and interrogated 2 years later. When asked what weapon he feared most, he did not hesitate. "The bazooka," he said, "not because it was powerful, but because it made us feel helpless. You could not see it. You could not prepare for it. Any bush, any wall, any hole in the ground could hide death." His words echoed those of another German veteran, interviewed at a prisoner camp near Salzburg. The bazooka changed the air in battle. Before, we looked for guns, tanks, artillery. After, we looked at every shadow. Every soldier was dangerous. It made the battlefield small and endless. The weapon's psychological power had been as revolutionary as its physical effect. For centuries, warfare had depended on hierarchy, the few commanding destruction, the many absorbing it. The bazooka blurred that boundary. It gave ordinary men the means to decide battles on their own. In 1948, at the U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, former imperial officers admitted that the American infantry's firepower had astonished them more than the atomic bomb. General Shizuichi Tanaka, who had commanded forces on the home islands, remarked, "We expected tanks and ships. We did not expect every American soldier to carry a weapon that could destroy a tank. That was the real secret." The comment startled even the Americans present. It confirmed what some had begun to suspect, that the bazooka had not only changed tactics, but psychology. It had destroyed the old idea of the helpless infantryman, just as surely as it had destroyed the myth of invulnerable armor. The U.S. Army's own post-war studies revealed something even deeper. The bazooka had reshaped industrial logic itself, because it could be built in workshops, assembled by unskilled labor, and transported by truckloads. It became the perfect symbol of the American way of war: quantity, mobility, and adaptability over elegance. During 1944 alone, U.S. factories produced over 475,000 bazookas and more than 15 million rockets. That figure, staggering even in retrospect, meant that every division could replace its entire complement several times over. For every tank the Germans built, the Americans built 100 weapons capable of destroying it. The Germans had once mocked such arithmetic. Now it was destiny. By the early 1950s, the world had changed. The Cold War was beginning, and in both East and West, the bazooka's descendants stood ready. In Korea, the U.S. M20 Super Bazooka met Soviet-supplied 35s and 34 85s on frozen hillsides, proving that the shaped charge principle born in a Tunisian ditch still ruled the battlefield. In Moscow, Soviet engineers studied captured American designs and produced their own versions, culminating in the RPG-2 and later the RPG-7. The lineage was unmistakable: a straight steel tube, a shaped charge, and the idea that one man could stop an armored column. What had begun as a crude American experiment had become a universal language of war. In 1985, at a veterans' reunion in Hawaii, American and German survivors of the Tunisian campaign met for the first time. They were old men now, their memories softened by time. A display table showed artifacts from both sides: a battered M1A1 launcher, a Panzer Schreck, and a rusted Panzer Three armor plate with a neat circular hole burned straight through. A German veteran pointed at the hole and smiled sadly. That was the day we learned the future belonged to the man on foot. The American beside him nodded, and to a little pipe with a big idea. They shook hands. For a moment, the war was gone, and only the truth remained that in December of 1942, near Tebourba, Tunisia, the old world of warfare had cracked open. And from that small rupture had poured the future: portable firepower, decentralized destruction, and the end of armored certainty. The laughter that had begun that morning had long since died. In its place stood the quiet acknowledgement that a steel tube and a shaped charge had changed everything. The age of armor had not ended, but the age of the infantryman had begun. Spring 1947. In a quiet corner of the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, Maryland, a single display case stood apart from the great hulks of tanks and artillery. Inside lay a thin, olive-drab steel tube, chipped, burned, its paint blistered by the desert sun. The placard beneath it read, "Captured by German forces near Tebourba, Tunisia, December 2, 1942. First known example of the American M1A1 rocket launcher, Bazooka." Visitors walked past it without pause. Few realized that this crude, unassuming pipe had done what the great guns and armored divisions could not. It had changed the logic of modern war. In the years since the fighting had ended, armies across the world had drawn their own conclusions. The British developed the PIAT, an awkward spring-launched projector that had saved countless lives in Normandy. The Germans' Panzerfaust became the blueprint for post-war European anti-tank weapons. The Soviets transformed the idea into the RPG-2, perfecting it with the later RPG-7. And the Americans, whose soldiers had once fired that first primitive bazooka in Tunisia, now fielded the M20 Super Bazooka, longer, stronger, and built for the jet age. Every army, regardless of ideology, now accepted a single truth. The age of absolute armored dominance was over. But the story was never just about steel and explosives. It was about understanding. In the early months of the Cold War, German officers working for the newly formed Bundeswehr studied their wartime archives with quiet fascination. One report from 1943, found in a dusty file labeled Butwaffen USA, Captured Weapons, United States described the bazooka as a crude but decisive equalizer. Another memo, written in January 1944 by an anonymous panzer officer, contained a single haunting sentence. "The enemy has placed the power of the artilleryman into the hands of the infantryman." That sentence became a prophecy. For centuries, armies had believed that the most destructive power must be concentrated in fortresses, in cannons, in tanks, in bombers. The bazooka proved the opposite. Power could be distributed, given to many instead of few, and once distributed, it could never again be taken away. The historians who gathered for the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo saw the same pattern. One American speaker, Colonel Daniel Hallman, summarized it simply. The bazooka was not the end of the tank, it was the beginning of the individual battlefield. It marked the moment when a soldier's courage and a nation's industry became one equation. Hallman was right. The weapon's genius lay in its synthesis, industrial logic meeting battlefield necessity. It was born not from artistry, but from urgency. From Alexander de Seversky's shaped charge experiments to the engineers at the U.S. Point Army Ordnance Department, the weapon had evolved not through perfectionism, but through practicality. It was what America excelled at, taking an idea and making it reproducible, reliable, and relentless. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 470,000 bazookas. Germany, under bombardment and blockade, managed fewer than 10,000 Panzerschrecks. Numbers alone did not tell the story, but they revealed the essence of modern warfare. Quantity became a quality of its own. In 1945, after Germany's surrender, an interrogation report from a captured Luftwaffe officer contained an unusual remark. The Americans did not fight with better machines. They fought with more of everything, more guns, more planes, more food, more time. Even their simple weapons were infinite. It was the ultimate admission of defeat, not to superior strategy, but to the unstoppable arithmetic of production. The bazooka, mass-produced by the thousands, symbolized that arithmetic. It was a weapon any nation could build, but only one nation could build endlessly. By the late 1940s, as jet engines screamed over Korea and nuclear weapons loomed on the horizon, some believed the bazooka would fade into history. It did not. It multiplied in design, in philosophy, in influence. Infantrymen carried new models with folding barrels and rocket-assisted warheads. Guerrillas and partisans used them in jungles, deserts, and cities. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the rice paddies of Indochina, the hiss of the rocket and the flash of shaped fire became the universal sound of resistance. In every war since, whether fought by great powers or by insurgents in forgotten valleys, its echo remains the legacy of a discovery made on a dusty Tunisian road. Decades later, in 1985, at that reunion in Hawaii, a German veteran and an American infantryman stood side by side, staring at a black and white photograph of a destroyed Panzer Three. The hole in its armor gleamed like an eye. The German said softly, "We thought we understood war. Then we saw this." The American nodded. So did we. They shook hands, soldiers who had once fought on opposite sides of a revolution they both helped create. The bazooka had begun as a joke, a crude experiment of pipes and wires. But in its smoke and simplicity lay the future, and somewhere, in the dust of Tebourba, under the sun of December 2nd, 1942, the modern battlefield had been born with a hiss, a flash, and the end of certainty. Autumn 1953. The Korean peninsula lay scarred from 3 years of fire and stalemate. Smoke still rose from the ridgelines above the 38th parallel, and the fields were littered with the remnants of another generation's learning curve. Among them, rusted in the mud near Panmunjom, lay the unmistakable silhouette of a new weapon longer, heavier, and painted in American olive drab, the M20 Super Bazooka. It was the descendant of the humble M1A1 captured in Tunisia 11 years before. Twice the range, twice the punch, twice the weight. The bazooka had matured into something formidable. It had also become global. Across the battlefield, the enemy fired its own answer, the Soviet RPG-2, a near mirror of the German Panzerfaust. Two armies, two ideologies, separated by oceans and systems, now met using weapons born from the same wartime revelation that the power to destroy armor could rest on a single soldier's shoulder. The line from Tebourba to Panmunjom was clear as shrapnel. The bazooka had not just changed technology, it had changed philosophy. When the armistice came in July of that year, U.S. Army analysts compiled their after-action reports. The numbers told a familiar story. Infantry using the M20 had destroyed more than 4,000 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns. But more telling than destruction was adaptation. Chinese and North Korean forces, initially reliant on massed armor attacks, had learned caution. By 1952, tank assaults were rare. Infantry had reasserted dominance. The balance of warfare had shifted again, not toward machines, but back toward men. General Matthew Ridgway, commander of United Nations forces, summarized it in his post-war debrief. The bazooka made every hill a fortress. A platoon could hold off an entire armored regiment. The age of massed armor is finished mobility. Dispersion will define the next war. He was right. The doctrine of mobility, small units, independent firepower, decentralized command became the new gospel of Western armies. The bazooka had written it in smoke and fire. In Moscow, Soviet generals reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction. The Red Army's archives show that by 1954, the RPG-2 was being produced at a rate of 100,000 units per year. Soviet advisors carried it to Vietnam, Egypt, and the Middle East. To them, it was not just a weapon, but an idea that a peasant soldier could destroy a symbol of Western might with a tube and a rocket. The bazooka's children had gone global, becoming instruments of both liberation and terror. In Hanoi, a young Vo Nguyen Giap watched Soviet advisors demonstrate the RPG-2 in 1956. His observation, recorded later in his memoir, reads, "The enemy's machines are mighty, but the infantryman now carries thunder. No power can rule the earth forever when a man can strike steel with his shoulder." The irony was complete. A weapon born from America's industrial abundance had become the equalizer of the poor, the tool of guerrilla warfare against the very empire that had invented it. Meanwhile, in the factories of the United States, Lockheed, Ford, and General Motors engineers, veterans of wartime production, turned their attention from tanks to missiles. The principles of the bazooka portable rockets, shaped charges, electric ignition, and modular assembly formed the technical foundation for the next generation of weapons: the recoilless rifle, the LAW, and the Dragon, and eventually the Javelin. What had begun as a simple electrical firing circuit powered by a dry cell battery now became the lineage of guided precision. The bazooka's DNA ran through every shoulder-fired weapon that followed, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq. In 1965, during Operation Starlight in Vietnam, American Marines used the M72 LAW to destroy fortified Viet Cong bunkers. The officers who wrote the after-action report noted the weapon's ancestry. The LAW is the grandson of the bazooka, lighter, deadlier, and as decisive as ever. Even 23 years after its first combat use, the spirit of the bazooka was alive in every rocket that hissed from a soldier's shoulder. Yet the weapon's true legacy was not in explosions but in economics. It had proven that small, inexpensive innovations could reshape strategy as effectively as grand technological projects. For every $1 billion spent on tanks, a few $100 worth of rockets could balance the scale. By the 1970s, defense theorists called it the Tebourba principle, the moment when the marginal cost of destruction fell to the level of the individual. From that point forward, no military machine, however advanced, could guarantee invulnerability. This realization rippled through strategy, politics, and industry. Armored warfare no longer defined victory. Wars would now be won or lost by whoever could adapt fastest to a world where the battlefield belonged to the foot soldier with the cheapest weapon. By the end of the Cold War, that truth had become universal. American soldiers in Europe trained with the Dragon missile. Soviet conscripts learned the RPG-7. Both traced their lineage to the same December morning in 1942, when a group of German Panzergrenadiers had laughed at a strange tube lying beside a burned-out truck. The laughter had long since faded. In its place came respect, even reverence for the simplicity that had undone empires. In 1995, the U.S. National Museum of Military History opened a new exhibit titled The Infantry Revolution. At its center stood two artifacts, an American M1A1 bazooka and a German Panzerschreck. A single caption linked them: captured and copied, mocked and mastered, the weapon that taught the world that the smallest soldier could wield the greatest power. Visitors lingered there, staring at the scorched metal, imagining the men who had first held those tubes in their hands, the Americans who built them, the Germans who captured them, and the soldiers who carried their descendants into every war since. The bazooka had outlived its inventors, its enemies, and even the era of the tank itself. But its meaning endured, that power, once democratized, can never again be contained. The infantryman, once the smallest piece on the board, had become the deciding one. And it all began on a cold December morning near Tebourba, when a handful of soldiers stumbled upon a steel tube, a battery wire, and the idea that would change the world. Spring, 1968. Saigon burned. From the roof of the U.S. Embassy, smoke curled upward into the humid air, carrying the sound of small arms fire and distant explosions. Amid the chaos of the Tet Offensive, a group of North Vietnamese sappers crouched behind a shattered wall. One raised a shoulder-fired rocket, a Soviet RPG-2, its paint scuffed, its fins bent. The soldier fired. The blast punched through an American M41 tank's turret, igniting ammunition. In seconds, the tank was a furnace. The weapon was simple. The philosophy was not. A straight line connected that moment in Saigon to a frozen December dawn near Tebourba 26 years earlier, when a handful of Germans had first held an American M1A1 launcher and realized, with a chill, that armor no longer guaranteed survival. That revelation, born in the sands of Tunisia, now circled the world. The 20th century had begun with the tank as the symbol of dominance, steel, motion, and certainty. It ended with the rocket portable, cheap, and defiant. Between those two symbols lay the story of how modern war was democratized. The bazooka had been the first weapon to brand. place the power of mechanized destruction in the hands of ordinary men. It shattered the hierarchy of war. What once required factories and logistics could now be achieved by a single soldier in a ditch. In doing so, it rewrote not only tactics but geopolitics. By the 1970s, every insurgent army on Earth carried its descendant. In the Middle East, RPG-7s turned the balance against Israeli armor in the Yom Kippur War. In Afghanistan, Mujahideen fighters wielded Chinese copies of the RPG-2 against Soviet convoys. In Africa, liberation movements used them to bring down colonial tanks and convoys. A weapon once born from the wealth of American industry had become the emblem of rebellion against industrial empires. It was the ultimate irony, the machine that had guaranteed Allied victory in 1944 now guaranteed that no empire could ever rule unchallenged again. At the Pentagon, strategists struggled to comprehend this new reality. A confidential memorandum written in 1973 by Colonel James Elmore, later declassified, stated, "The shoulder-fired anti-armor weapon is not merely a tool of defense. It represents a social shift, the end of centralized military power. The tank may be built by governments, but its killer can be built in a garage." He was right. The age of invincibility was over. No longer could industrial superiority alone ensure dominance. The battlefield had fragmented every hill, every alley, every ruined city now capable of harboring decisive firepower. That was the bazooka's true legacy, the collapse of military monopoly. In Munich, former Wehrmacht officers lecturing at the Bundeswehr Command Academy used the Tunisian discovery as a case study in humility. One of them, General Heinz Kruger, told his students, "In 1942, we laughed at a pipe. In 1945, we built our own. By 1960, every nation had one. Never laugh at simplicity, it will be your undoing." His words became a quiet maxim among soldiers and engineers alike. Simplicity was not weakness, it was inevitability. By the late Cold War, the concept had evolved further. Electronics replaced wires, optics replaced iron sights, and microchips began to whisper guidance into the soldier's hands. Yet, despite the sophistication, the essence remained the same: a man, a shoulder, a rocket, and the promise that no tank, no matter how mighty, could ever be completely safe. In 1983, during Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada, American Rangers carried M72s to destroy armored cars. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, U.S. Marines used AT-4s to eliminate Iraqi T-72 tanks buried in sand berms. The principle was unchanged from Tunisia: mobility, proximity, precision. Every blast echoed a lineage, stretching back to the desert road near Tebourba. By the 21st century, the bazooka had become both an artifact and a prophecy fulfilled. Modern anti-armor systems, the American Javelin, the Israeli Spike, the Russian Cornet, all carried the same soul: portable defiance against steel. In the museums of Washington, London, and Berlin, the original M1A1 rests behind glass, its paint faded to a ghostly green. Tourists walk by, unaware that this simple tube once terrified empires and redefined combat. But the soldiers who understand its story, historians, veterans, engineers, stop and stare a little longer. They see not a relic, but a revelation. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, U.S. forces entered Baghdad. With precision-guided missiles and thermal imaging yet on the same streets, insurgents carried RPG-7s, descendants of the bazooka's blueprint. Technology had advanced beyond imagination, but the war's essence had not changed. For every billion-dollar tank, there was still a man with $100 rocket waiting in the dust. It was a grim symmetry, the bazooka's final legacy. In 2020, at the U.S. National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a new exhibit opened, The Weapon That Ended Invincibility. Inside, visitors found the story told from the beginning: the M1, A1 at Tebourba, the captured reports of the German army, the post-war proliferation across the world. A digital display looped a quotation from a 1947 U.S. Army report. The bazooka did not just destroy tanks, it destroyed the idea that any man-made machine could be safe from the will of man. A Marine in Korea, a guerrilla in Vietnam, a fighter in Afghanistan. All different faces, one identical posture, a shoulder raised, a tube aimed, a spark igniting. The curators called it the moment where power changed hands. And so the story of the bazooka ends, where it began not with glory, but with realization. In December of 1942, a German platoon looked at an absurd American contraption and laughed. In their laughter lay the last moment of certainty the modern world would ever know. Because from that day forward, no empire, no army, no machine could ever again claim invincibility. The bazooka had seen to that a pipe of steel and fire that gave every soldier the same voice in the language of destruction. It was the sound of history democratized and of the world learning, one rocket at a time, that nothing made by men would ever again be beyond reach.